On behalf of the Department of English and Modern European Languages, I welcome all of you to our lecture on translation series. And we have in our midst our beloved teacher, professor, poet, novelist, friend, translator, Professor GJV Prasad. He says that in his previous avatar, he was Professor of English at Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has been the former director of the Jawaharlal Nehru Institute of Advanced Study at JNU. His major research interests, well, his interests are varied. He has interest in Indian English literature, contemporary theatre, Dalit writings, Australian literature, translation theory, and also disability studies. He has co-edited with Sara Rai a collection of stories from Indian languages, Imaging the Other. His academic publications include Continuities in Indian English Poetry, Nation, Language, Form, and Writing India, Writing English, along with 5 other edited volumes of critical essays, Vikram Seth, an anthology of recent criticism, The Lost Temper, essays on Look Back in Anger, Translation and Culture Studies, Indian Perspectives, Violets in a Crucible, Translating the Orient, and Indian English and Vernacular India. Professor Prasad is also a poet and a novelist. His publications include 3 books, that is A Clean Breast is a novel, In Delhi Without a Visa, a book of poems, and Imaging the Other, an anthology of short stories. Here he has a book which was edited by him last year, Disability in Translation, edited by Someshwar Sati and GJV Prasad. Then the book that we are going to discuss today is A Red-Necked Green Bird, a beautiful translation of stories written by Ambai, a Tamil writer, beautiful writer, and it's an amazing collection that we have in our midst that I would recommend this book to each one of you because the book deals with multiple aspects of life: death, love, longing, disability, animals, birds, human beings. The entire book has an amazing collection of stories that leave a lump in your throat. And I'm really happy and extremely grateful to you, Professor Prasad, that you accepted my invitation. And I'm really looking forward to your presence today. Ours has been a long association. I must tell this to my students that during my MPhil days, Professor Prasad was my teacher at JNU. And today, I seek his blessings and I'm really, really happy. Thank you, Professor Prasad, for joining us. And we are all looking forward to your talk on translating India. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rano. And thank you for your very kind introduction. You might have noticed when you're showing the English version of the book, or showing the Tamil version of the book, right?
Oh, yes,
that's Tamil. So, so I just thought that if it can be seen clearly enough, the script is so different, right? And the script is different, obviously, not just from the English, but from other Indian languages, right? So this is something that you go around India and you try to read, signs, signboards, road signs. You realize that some scripts are so close to the script of your own language and you think you should be able to read it, and very often you get frustrated because you can't. Like if you're Gujarat and you say, I should be able to read it. It's so frustrating because you can't. And you're just there. You think you recognize everything, right? But what if you don't recognize the script at all? It's so different. And this is our country. We have different scripts across the country, right? So when I'm talking about translating India, I thought that is a way to get to talk about the book for very many reasons. One, shorthand, critical shorthand. All of us know this. We have 22 languages in our H schedule, which does not include English. And then we talk about official languages, associated official languages of various states and union territories. We've got about 30 odd languages, 35 languages if you count them, associate languages and across the country, and official languages. But yet, so many of them obviously are not in the schedule, right? And in the schedule, you have languages that are not official languages of any state. and at least one of them did recently, but others not at all. So it's very odd when you look at that. So what happens to other languages? Where are they? They're official languages of this country, but not in the schedule. So what happens to them? And of course, if you ask around, people give you an astonishing number of languages, right? People talking about Arunachal Pradesh will say, Arunachalis will say, there are about 200 odd mutually unintelligible languages being spoken out there. So they have a lingua franca, which is Hindi, which is interesting because it is counterintuitive. You will think, why Hindi? And if you ask an Arunachali why Hindi, the Arunachali will tell you, because it is not Assamese. So what is the Arunachal Pradesh person telling you? Is that Assamese was the language that oppressed them. That was the hegemonic language. So they chose a language, another Indian language, Hindi. Oh, that's interesting. Why not English? Oh, why not English? Because of the states in the Northeast, one state that decided that it would be part of, very clear what signal that's part of India, was Arunachal Pradesh, because it has this giant neighbor which doesn't recognize its Indianness at all, which is China. So there's one state which has to say, I'm not China, I'm India. So that is where the translating India also comes in from. It comes from idea of India. What is India? And how do we get this idea of India across? It's fraught with difficulties in any case, from definition to understanding, right? Of general understanding. What do I mean by that? Because after all, in the Constitution, when we talk about, the people of India, etc., etc. What do we say a country should be called? India, that is Bharat, shall be a union of states. India, that is Bharat. It is not Bharat, that is India. It is India, that is Bharat. It's interesting that is a whole language debate about it in the Constituent Assembly about what we should call ourselves. I just want to point to one thing. They debate about whether we should call India at all, because after all, India is a foreign name. India is not the name we give ourselves. In any case, we all know this. Sindhu, the land of Sindhu, becomes the Indus, right? Becomes Indus, right? So Sindhu becomes Hindu in Old Persian. So Hindus are people who live near Hindus are people who live near Sindhu, right? The Sindhu River is Hindu River. Hindus are the people who live there. And then, so it's not something that we call ourselves. And then the Indus becomes Indian. And there you have Herodotus talking about us for the first time in recorded history, that we are our country, that country is called India, and we're Indians. So obviously in the Constituent Assembly, they were saying even further that India was something that was constructed by the English. We should not talk of ourselves as India. We should give ourselves another name, an ancient name, something which will bring us back to an idea of our culture, etc., etc. But obviously no one wanted to give up that name India, because India was the subcontinent in a certain sense, and we wanted to, I guess, very clearly state that India was what is continuing. What broke away was not India, it was Pakistan, and we didn't necessarily want Pakistan to break away. So we wanted to keep the name India. And in this assembly, people saying we should be called Bharat, that is called India in English, Bharat, that is called India in foreign languages. After a great deal of debate, we come. But interesting, India, that is Bharat. Interestingly, no one, even though throughout the debate, most of them are talking about India as Hindustan, Hindustan was never considered as the name of India. And I don't want to go into all that now. We can if you want to, but that's different. But the point is that when you're talking about India, you're always already talking about translation. That's all I wanted to bring in here. We have multiple languages across the country. We have different linguistic cultures. As I said, we have different scripts. We don't understand each other unless we translate. We cannot understand each other unless we translate. So we are a translation zone. India is a translation zone. Because if we don't translate our languages into each other or into a language that all of us read or many of us read and from which we can translate further, we can never come together. Even the parliament cannot function if we do not translate. right? So we need to translate. A constitution cannot be read if we do not translate. So translation is, translating India is in the sense, therefore, A, for ourselves, translating India for ourselves, to deepen, or to help us understand and come together as India, as Indians. So we are translating India for ourselves. That's the first point I want to make when I say translating India. I'm not saying translating India for foreigners. I'm not saying translating India for the West or the East or the North or the South. No, no, no. Translating India for us. Because our India really comes together and is coming together, has to still further come together in translation. If it doesn't, right now its translation is imperfect. We are therefore always at odds with each other. We haven't understood each other. There are lots of parts of the country which just feel neglected, marginalized, and I'm not even then. And if you think it through, you will say it's not just parts of the country, it's peoples within those parts of the country, peoples across the country who feel that they have not been given space in this idea of India, which can only come through translating them. And do we translate enough? Do we translate at all? And then quickly, I want to go on to a lot of this, of course, involves the idea of translating into each other's languages. One of the ways in which we look at India is from our own location. And if from your location, whether it is in a small village in Tamil Nadu or a small village in Kashmir, the way you look at whether you come together is in how the country or the nation state is given to you in your language. It comes to you in your language, right? If it doesn't, it's outside your imagination, and in a sense, therefore, you're outside its imagination. How do you come together? So a lot of translation has to take place between Indian languages. Does it? Not yet, which is a sad thing. But there's been now for what, maybe 20, 30 years almost, really, speaking a greater degree and more and more translation, especially now in this century, into English from various Indian languages into English. If you say, did Indian languages never talk to each other? Of course they did. They always talk to each other, right? Otherwise, how would this idea of cultural contiguity would actually have ever come if epics had not been translated, if philosophy had not been translated into various Indian languages? Some of the modern Indian languages actually come into existence in this kind of translation, and a kind of status. They derive a status. They derive, and establish themselves by translating. So Indian languages needed to talk to each other at various points of time properly. And of course, during the national struggle, there was a lot of, let's say, conversation between Indian languages, an idea to imagine the nation they were struggling for. So that is, sometimes I would say, maybe we don't have a national literature, but we had a nationalist literature at a certain point of time. So what can we do? What is happening in terms of translating India is that instead of translating India, one of the things that people always tend to do is to centralize, right, the project. That is, we have to translate one idea of India, which defines everything. But we can translate in order to show the variety, the different pulls, the different pressures of the country, and the idea of one clear, homogeneous idea of India. So the heterogeneity can be brought forth to everybody. How every life is different. How can this happen when you're all translating into one language? This can happen as you translate from one language to another in India. So a Kashmiri reading a Tamil story may actually see how different Tamil people are, right? But a Kashmiri and a Gujarati and a Bengali reading a Tamil story in English, and reading Bengali stories in English and reading Gujarati stories in English may tend to give you one India, right? A certain India, because it's the same English. So there is a problem here that translators have to be aware of. Sometimes it's good. So somebody may turn around, as Sujit Mukherjee did, that perhaps it's in this kind of translation that you may actually discover that there is something called Indian literature, singular. That when you translate various Indian languages into one language, you actually realize how close they are to each other, right? So how we have an Indian literature. But obviously, my politics here, what I'm talking about is to keep up the differences, right? To show the nuances, to show that we are together, but we are different, and to celebrate the difference. Translating India, in a sense, is celebrating the celebrating the differences in this country, the celebrating the diversity of this country. And you get this very easily, very early in your life when you meet people from across different parts of the country. If you actually meet people from different parts of the country, if you're going to live in a hostel life with people from other parts of the country coming in, you realize that there is so much they don't know about you and your culture, and there is so much you don't know about them and their culture. And even that is homogenized, because when you meet somebody from Tamil country, you may think they represent Tamil Nadu. They don't. Tamil Nadu is equally diverse. There are different religions, there are different communities, there are different castes, and Tamil is spoken differently by different people. So and then of course gender plays a big role. So it's not as if you can say there is one Tamil, right? Culture, there's one Tamil. It's made up of various things. You can always talk about dominance and what is a dominant culture, what is politically strong, powerful, those kind of things. Otherwise, people across that state, the state of Tamil Nadu or any other state in this country, will be very different. There'll be so much hierarchy, so much differentiation, right? Which is why I think translating helps to understand all this. But as I said, when you go into a hostel life and you see these people, automatically say, oh my God, they're so different. They eat different kinds of food. They prepare food differently. The tastes are so different, right? The music is different. The dance is different. The clothes are different, right? And when it strikes you so hard, and you can stop saying things like we Indians, right? You stop thinking of yourself as singular representative of what India means, right? You even stop, when you meet other people from other parts of your state, talking of yourself as somebody who's completely knowledgeable about what being Bengali means or what being Odia means. You don't. There are other Odias who completely, debunk you and your ideas of the state. So that's how it is. And you learn all this when you meet people. You learn all this when you meet literature, when you read literature and translation. It's a translator's role to play this. That is, the translator has to play this crucial role. The translator has to. And the translator English has a curious problem, therefore, because the translator into English has to convey in English the differences that these various locations mean. And when you translate from Indian language to English, you realize how this is a given, almost all translators say how inadequate English is to express the different kinds of colors of Indian life, right? The different nuances, the different, kinship patterns, the politeness, and the way, and the indirection that many of us have as part of our polite talk. How English can only exoticize, English cannot bring it through naturally. I think one good thing that's happened for translators, though I've been saying this as a decade, I've been saying this for 3 decades or more, is that more and more people accept now, not when I started saying it, they accept writers whom they think of as Indian writers in English, right? I tend to think of it as Indian English writers. Why? Because I like to see what they do with English in India, right? How Indian English actually becomes Indian Englishes, and not just Indian Englishes in terms of location, but also in terms of writer. What can the writer do with English in order to make the language articulate the various locations the writer is talking about, right? So most Indian language writers, and I've said this before, I will not go into this debate in this particular talk unless it becomes necessary. Most Indian English writers are translators. Not most, all of them are translators. If you're an Indian English writer, you're a translator, because lives are not led in English or completely in English in India. If you want to talk about lives led completely in English in India, talking about what? Even people who say that they do They're not talking about the complete lives. You cannot live in India, go out of a house, meet people, and say, I live my life completely in English. It's not possible. It's not possible. Unless you know no other language. But then your English is colliding with other people's other languages. If you are a expat who's coming to India, even those people I'm saying, if you're an English person speaking English, living in India, you go to the market and you go to this railway station and you go everywhere speaking English, people are replying to you in different languages. People are speaking around you in different language. You're overhearing, you're trying to understand, you're trying to see if you're being cheated in a bargain, right? So you are picking up smattering of the language because you need to. I've talked about this. I talked about this recently about this wonderful writer Sharma and Sharma and I were doing a reading together in the days I thought of myself as a novelist. So, and so she was reading from a new novel, and she had a railway station scene where the character was bargaining with the coolie in English, and as she read it, I said, Shama, they were speaking English to each other. She said, yeah. I said, oh my God, he could never got the price down. The coolie would have started off it, asking a huge rate and sticking with it because he's speaking English to the coolie. And she said, but this is an English novel. So I told her, but it's an Indian English novel. So you could have somewhere used an Indian, if it's Delhi Hindi word, and then carried on in English, but at least some hint that the bargaining was taking place in Hindi. That was necessary there. And she felt it wasn't. But there was no difference between what I was saying and what she was saying. She was saying she's a complete translator. That the Indian English writer is a translator, so she translated the Hindi completely to English. Whereas I am a rough translator. I like a lot of the local language to come in for people to understand they're reading a translation, to move the people a little bit from their smug English reading chairs to move into a life led in a different language. So I would think that to translate India, you need to think like an Indian English writer, to try and use all the resources of available to you in terms of India and English, to make the same decisions that creative writers also make, but perhaps with a more sense of consciousness about it. What words to retain, what kinship terms to retain, what to translate, how to make it not sound British or American, but to sound Indian, right? And then, if possible, sound Tamilian, or sound Bombay, or sound Kolkata. How do I go about this? What do I do to retain that texture of the story, that layer of the story? So I would say that when you're translating, first thing that I got rid of is most translators who translate English in India have struggled with the idea of not clearly enunciating to them who they are translating for. And I suggest we need to translate for ourselves, for Indians, right? So that takes care of one problem. You don't need to use foreign words and foreign cultural terms to explain what is Indian. You can try and do it in another Indian terms if you want, right? But why would you use foreign terms for it, right? Why would I try to describe a beti, call it a sarong? I would not, right? Something tried like a sarong. I would not do it. I would not talk about lungi being something tried like a sarong. But people have done that before. People have done that because uncertainty of audience, right? I don't need to explain many terms because, again, not just because I would want people to work and figure things out for themselves, but also because I have an understanding that, it's not too difficult to find what these things mean if you're an Indian, right? And even then you have to make choices. For example, I had to make a choice about, let's say, a dress. Pavadai Davani. Now, when I'm saying Davani, I have an Indian English term, which is a Tamil term, Tamil Indian English term, if you want, for it, which is half sari, right? Which was used very commonly when I was growing up. They would say she was wearing a half sari, right? And what that meant was the dhamani. It's you're still wearing a skirt, so it's a pavada, a ghagra. You're still wearing that. So half sari didn't mean what they tried to make popular in Hindi films at one point of time, which is a mini, like akin to a mini skirt. This half sari is a very modest thing that girls are trained to wear before they start wearing a sari, right? So I could have used half sari, but I said no, it's fallen out into disuse now, right? People may not understand what I'm saying anyway, even if I'm using what I think is a very good Indian English term. Uh, so what do I do? So I just retain the Tamil term, or should I go on to explain it somehow? And I said, forget it. I'll use the Tamil term. Let them hunt for it in Google. They'll find it. Some of the issues I had to take was like that to see if Google actually came up with with the term. If it didn't, then how will they ever find out, right? So those are so when the actually the collection begins. It begins with one explanation, which is interesting because that is not a strategy I use otherwise. It starts off with the dose kal. A dose kal is, and then I say something which is the frying pan, no, the tawa for the making dosa. Now, I cannot privilege one language over another. I cannot privilege Hindi over English, over Tamil. Sorry. So I just said dosa kal, the frying pan. Right? You understand immediately what I'm talking about, right? And it's just not used only for dosa, but it is here when you say, and if you actually look at kal means stone. So nobody's going to understand if they Google, they find dosa is dosa, kal is stone. What is this? So I said, right, let me use it because they see what a located term it is, and then I'll say frying pan. So these are kind of decisions that you take when you're translating, right? Some work, some don't work. You learn from errors. It's always good somebody else reads you, right? When you're translating. And I had my stories read by very many people, including the writer of the Tamil, Ambai. C.S. Lakshmi read all the stories in translation. So she had things to suggest. We quarreled about certain things that I was doing. And certain things that, for example, and I'm going to end here with translating India because I'm going back to something which was written a long time ago. This is in the Katha Prize Stories #1, volume #1, and it's a wonderful, wonderful introduction there, kind of translate how to translate note kind of thing. I'm forgetting what it was actually called, by Rimli Bhattacharya, which went missing in later editions. Rimli Bhattacharya talks about how you can translate Indian languages, literatures into English while retaining the plurality of locations. And one of the things she says is, look, if I'm doing a story from one of the Dravidian languages and they say kumkumam or kumkuma, I will not turn it to kumkum. I'll let kumkuma or kumkumam be, right? So, and she goes on to say how you can kind of try and retain some things, even though it will be understood across India, but it's said with a different, slightly different pronunciation or slightly different. I will use it. But part of the problem, as she realizes, is that the English that you do, right, you will use Indian terms from Indian languages the way all of us do. But all of us are not from the same part of India. It's one of the things she goes on to say, that the way all of us do, but all of us are not from the same part of India. It is actually what she's saying is that each of us do, not all of us, but each of us. Right? If you read it as each of us, each one of us is comfortable talking to people using certain Indian terms in that location, which we may not use when we are speaking to other people in other parts of India. Right? In other locations, we may not be comfortable using those words. So each of us in specific situations. That's the tough bit, which is why Suzy, Tarun, Lalita, when they do the huge translation volumes, give up on all this. They finally say they decide to use only those Indian terms that can be found in Webster's. Otherwise not. So which has already entered the English language in terms of the West. Right. So you see how I'm trying to keep the difference between that, and what I'm saying is different from saying what is entered Webster's. I'm saying no, not necessarily at all. But what I think needs just a little bit of work for us to understand, for us to. And last final words, really, before I can stop. You can see this in terms of kinship terms. You can see this in terms of food, right? What do I do with names of food items? What do I do, right? Because it may mean nothing to people from reading from a different culture. That word term, they may not even understand whether it is a drink or or edible, something you eat, or is it something that is sweet or savory? Or is it, what is it? They may not have no idea what it looks like. So, what do I do? What do I do? These are things you have to think about, depending. And I'm not saying there is one size that fits all, one answer that will work for everyone. No, but the questions work for everyone. These are all questions you have to think about. I think I should stop here because I said I'd speak for about 20-25 minutes. When I talked to Ranu, I already spoke for more than half an hour. So,
No, you've raised some very pertinent questions here, Professor Prasad. And I remember that when we were doing our graduation and masters, the emphasis was on, reading Flaubert, Borges. You should know what André Gide has written and how Turgenev writes. And I'm very happy to see that over the years, we have come to realize that it is very important for us to know ourselves. And you have rightly said that translation is one way of knowing each other. And there is so much of good writing that is being done in India, in Hindi, Tamil, Telugu, Urdu, Kannada. And the rich diversity of our own culture is very important for us. And it's important that we get to know that. Get to know our own writers. Where it is said about a writer, either you publish or perish. In the same way, translate or perish. Now, the point is that when we talk of a good translation, you must have noticed this, Professor Prasad, that just as, a good translation gives a new life to a text, sometimes a bad translation can also kill a text. If it's a bad translation, it can kill a text.
We always wondered about Tagore, right?
Yeah.
I just as example, because it's when I first encountered Tagore in English, I couldn't figure out what all that excitement about Tagore was about, right? And I kept thinking that maybe Tagore does not work in translation, right? I was no great believer in translation to begin with. First, that I always felt you should know the language and read the person in the language they write in to really get the feel, the aesthetic, the way they use languages. I still believe that. That if you really want to get to a writer, the way they use language, that's a pleasure of reading. What the writer does with the language. Because if you're reading a translation, you're seeing what the translator does with the language, not what the writer did with the language. Right. So I have kept feeling for a very long time that I don't think I'd ever enjoy Tagore because it must be very much to do with how he uses Bengali rather than also what he says. Right. As the translations got better over the years, and in the last decade and a half, 2 decades, we had some wonderful translations. Even before, actually, when I first read Sujit Mukherjee's translation, you start saying, all right, there is so much more. William Radich's translation of Tagore's poetry, and you start enjoying the poetry. So you realize a bad translation may actually kill your interest in reading that particular writer and translation, and sometimes you may also not give that much respect to the writer, thinking it's very parochial kind of glory that was like a parochial interest that kept that writer going. But as I said, and as you say, I completely agree with you. A good translation can immediately change all that, help you accept the reputation of the writer in that language, sometimes make the reputation of the writer. If that's a writer that has been neglected, a translation may bring the spotlight back to the writer.
Yes, that's true.
Right? So that can also be done. Translation can work for the writer of the original as well, because it is not necessary, as I was saying just now in that thing, that you will be very popular or famous in your own language. A translation may make you popular. This may be slightly controversial, what I'm going to say next. I sometimes think about Perumal Murugan. He's such a wonderful writer. But is it because I'm in Delhi that I feel this, or is it actually so that Perumal Murugan actually got all that was due to him as a writer after a particular book was translated in English and became controversial? To me, it is interesting that in Tamil it was not controversial. It is translated in English and then becomes controversial. and then gets banned, and then all the chain reaction happens, and then Perumal Murugan comes out of it as a very well-known writer, as he should, because he's actually a very good writer. Right. So it's a complicated thing. I'm not just saying translation made him. I'm saying translation itself may not have made him, but the translation that's led to a controversy made his reputation. Right. And again, it's a controversy because obviously there are people who read him earlier who thought very highly of him in Tamil, but that's different.
I must say, thanks to you, Professor Prasad, for having translated Ambai, because her world comes alive to us. The flavor of the dishes and the names and the taste, everything stays with us as we read her stories. And this is a brilliant translation. And I believe that in these difficult times, exasperating times, if a story can make you cry, it has to be different. And that way, Ambai is very different. And you have captured her, the subtlety, the nuances, the delicacy with which she speaks and she writes, you've captured it beautifully. And like everything that she writes, it really strikes a core. It hits you hard. And there was this story that a red-necked green bird, the title story, you have referred to this coppersmith barbet. We discussed it yesterday as well. I was trying to find out which bird is it. And I looked at the picture, and then you call her Semarbu Kukuruvan in Tamil. And then I tried to locate it. It's actually Kat Khora, Chota Basanta. And in Hindi, they call this bird Thatera. So, a bird that tries to speak, the way she has explained it, and some unusual things do come to the fore when we read her stories and we enter this world. It's a world which is very different, but it's intense. It hits you hard. And you have done a brilliant translation of her short stories. Especially there was the story, The Crow with a Swollen Throat. Now this whole concept of Punar Janam, somewhere it lies in the background of the story. When you refer to there's this connect that she tries to draw between the father and the crow. You immediately, it takes you back to the Indian tradition, the thought process that is there. And I think the book itself must be read for its sharp imagery, vivid description, and the way, with effortless ease, you have tried to bring her alive to all of us. Thank you so much for having done this translation. There's a lot that one can talk about, her affinity with birds and animals, and how she refers to the horsewoman there. There is this story which deals with the horsewoman, and how important it is that, she enters this very different terrain. Her visit to the hills.
The thing about Amba is her eye for detail. And it's apparent throughout. And the very rich cultural world that she lives in, that all of us live in our different ways, but her specific cultural world, which comes from having had a childhood and growing up years in the south of India, and then moving on to north to Delhi, and and having lived in, as I said, also then later on and settled down in Bombay, right, in Mumbai. So it both Hindustani music and Carnatic music are part of her world, right? And she's very much part of that, right? And so it's not that she of course has a very clear understanding and foot in the Hindu world, because the crow, for example, the idea of the crow's ancestor is the Pitru, the part of the Hindu thing that you give rise to the crow because you are actually giving oblations to your ancestors. So crow, that kind of thing, right? So it's there. For her world of references is a complete. It's so wide. And that as a translator, you have to actually work very hard. It cannot be easy, right? You have to work very hard because you have to hunt each thing down. When she's referring to because everything is translated into Tamil when she's writing. So when she's doing that, I have to figure out, as someone who belongs but does not belong completely to that world, you have to figure out whether it's a Hindustani rag that she's talking to or a Carnatic ragam, right? What is she talking? Because some of them have the same name, right? So she's talking about, she gives you abhang, she gives you various kinds of songs, from film songs to classical songs in Tamil translation. So I have to figure out what was it like in the original language, what was that saying? Right? So that when I'm translating further from the Tamil, it should not go so far away from the first text, right? Because hers is already the second text, the Tamil, right? It's already a translation of Marathi or Hindi or Punjabi or English, right? Whatever she is doing. So sometimes, of course, if it's English, it's fairly easy for me to go back to the English, but just to figure out what is it that she's translating from and look if the source is available to use it. But for all others, one had to work. One had to work very hard. The other is because I'm not a Bombayite, never lived in Bombay. I've been for very short visits to Bombay. I don't know Bombay, and her world is Bombay. In a lot of these stories, it's Bombay. She knows if she's talking about references, locations, routes, train routes, right? All that she talks about, I have no idea what she's talking about. I don't know when she talks about slow trains and fast trains, and she talks about particular stations, and she talks about over bridges, links. I don't have a sense of the geography that she has. I need to get it. I need to have that sense of geography. When she talks about trade union leaders, when she talks about writers, when she talks about things written about strikes, I need to know what she's talking about. What is the strike she's talking about? What it lead to? Because for her, it's something she knows, so she can refer to it easily. Whereas I had to work hard to make that easy reference in English, and thinking, because and I need to work hard because I cannot make errors here, right? Because I need to know what she's referring to, be able to refer to it in a similar manner. So it's not, and I'm glad that you feel that it works so well, right? Because it meant quite a bit of work, right? I mean, every reference of hers I had to hunt down, including, as I said, place names in Bombay. I had to hunt down, right? Terms she uses, Marathi terms, Gujarati terms. I had to figure out what they actually meant, right? How she'd used them, how I could use them, etc., etc. So it's when you're translating somebody from one language into another, there are different levels. One of the things that in India happens is that English and other Indian languages enter every language, right? So when English and other languages enter your language, right, and then I'm translating that into English, I have to figure out what to do with the English in that language. I have to figure out what to do with the other languages which come through the language, especially in the metropolises, right? If you're in Mumbai, there's so many languages that impact on you. How do I do that? And if she's talking about Tamil speakers in Mumbai, so there is a Tamil already there. There is a Gujarati. There is there is Marathi, and there is a Hindi, Mumbai a Hindi, all coming into this mix. And there is English that comes into it. And I have to ensure that it carries across into English, right? So it's complex. It's complex.
Yeah. Yes. There is this book, Disability in Translation, edited by you and Someshwar Sati, which was published by Routledge, where you have again talked about the mechanics of translating idioms of disability. And I'm glad that, linked with it is the upcoming collection of short stories on disability. It is indeed commendable that you are trying to emphasize on the subject of disability as a part of our social and academic consciousness. And this Disability in Translation is also a book which does talk of, the various stories and the papers that have been focusing on the various aspects of disability in different languages. What was that experience? How was that experience of yours with this particular text, Professor Prasad?
This, I must say something here, because after all, if you look at even on the Ambe collection, it has one story which would quite easily qualify as a disability story. And when someone asked me what this collection of Ambes was about, what would I, people say, if you're a novelist, they'll ask you, what's your novel about? And sometimes you feel like telling them, I wouldn't have written 300 pages if I could tell you in 2 lines what it's about. So I was thinking of a way of talking about Ambe's stories, which would satisfy them and which I would not, I would feel that didn't cheapen or lower the thing. And I said, they're all love stories. They're about all kinds of different ways of looking at love and different ways we experience love, and what love makes us all do at various points of our life. Right? That's what a best story is about. I said this is a way of also telling people, because as you said, a story can make you cry.
Yeah.
And when I started translating, I think I shared it with you the other day. When I read the first story that I read was the title story, right? And I kept it away. I kept the book away. I said, oh my God, it moved me so much. I said, I'm going to be translating this? How? And I kept it away. Then I read what is the first story in this book, Falling. I read that, and it moved me even more. So I said, maybe I shouldn't be translating this. Just read it one story at a time over 7-8 months and give up on it. I think about 7 months later, I started translating. Right. And then I translated within 3 months. Everything was done. Right. The final product was done. And why am I saying this? Is because the same kind of difficulty I felt, same kind of emotional turmoil when we're working on disability stories. Because it's a parallel, if you want. Because you feel bad about ourselves, how we approach each other, how we interact with each other, how we understand each other, how we make space for each other, how reluctant we are, how quick we are to judgment, how quick we are to marginalize, how quick we are to other, how language helps us all the time to do this, how we don't struggle against language in our daily lives in order to be inclusive, how we must, how we should be more inclusive, how we have to work at it, how actually, to put it in a kind of cliche, to be human is to be able to love unconditionally, right? To be able to love, and that is what I discovered was the absolute necessity, something that we have to stress, that we even have to conquer language if need be, in order to become better human beings. And we can become better human beings only by feeling the need to be inclusive, by being able to, and literature can push you to be in other people's, get positions, to be able to see. And that's what the disability workshop did for us. That is what translation of the short stories did for us. And that is what making people think about translating, the act of process of translating. And if you think of the process of translating, you think of language all the time, and what language does. It's not just that this is possible in one language, not other. No, all languages behave in a particular way, and how do you work on that? So that was, when you asked me what working on disability stories did for me, what the experience was like, editing, collection of essays on translating, I would say exactly like I felt when I was translating Ambe's stories. Right? That you need to translate in order to actually make sense of your own experience, and to make sense of what you are as a human being.
There has to be a connect between the writer and the translator. Only then can you bring it alive the way you've done it with Ambai. And I can see that it's come out in a very sensitive way, Prasad. And
with the writer, I agree. Let's put it even more so, connect with the writing. Right?
That's true.
Because connect with the writer, with Ambai, I say this because I know Ambai. We've known each other.
No, I mean writing. Yes, I definitely mean writing.
But I say this. I do say connect to the writer because I know Ambai so well. I sometimes think the connect to the writer word. But actually, if you look at it, if I had not known her also, I would have translated a similar way. So it is the connect to the writing.
That's true.
it helps,
We
I
may not
guess.
necessarily end up meeting the writer. Sometimes we tend to translate people we've not met in life, but then we love something and then we translate now. Let us keep this discussion open. There is Dr. Fatima Rizvi, there is Dr. Arvi Sharma, Professor Maitri Pridarshini, or any of our students. If you have any queries or questions, please put them in the chat box or switch on your video and please ask
Or switch
questions.
on your video and talk.
Yeah, they could just talk.
And
Yeah.
Professor Fatima has been had started
Yes,
working
yes.
before, so we can continue that as well.
Yeah. She has also done a lot of translation,
Yes.
and she understands the subtleties that are involved in the process. Yes, Dr. Rizvi.
Thank you, Professor Prasad. Thank you, Rano. Yeah, I was just thinking, Professor Prasad, while you were talking, you talked about how translation helps us to, to bridge differences or to get to know differences. I also thought that it helps us to know how familiar we are with each other without really, knowing it before the translation. That's one thing that I thought about. And the other thing that you said, if I understood correctly, you said that when Ambai was writing in Tamil, she was translating Hindi in Tamil, the songs, and
Yes. Yes.
okay, and so you had to translate. It was like a double translation or a double, understanding, deciphering actually. But then when you are translating, you are retaining the Hindi song. You are telling us, the Hindi songs, they ring such a familiar chord when we read them. Or, some of the poems that you write, you are retaining the original language. There is a difference between her writing and your translation then. And of course, it's much more interesting when you read the original language text in the English language text, folk songs, cultural songs, film songs, etc., poems, etc. But then why this difference? I mean, don't you think she's also translating in a way the
She
other
is. She's a
languages?
translator. Uh, the first thing you said, I must react to because
Yeah.
it's a very important statement that you're making. Uh, I sometimes elite, right? Because I think everybody will see the similarities, right? And what I was trying to establish is that translation will very easily establish similarities because the language of translation does that. If I'm writing about Tamil territory country in English, I'm writing about Bengali country in English, they may sound the same. And there will be many similarities. I establish it accidentally because I'm using language in a particular way, right? So this is why I was saying, let's also learn to celebrate differences, right? Yes, and if any people that misunderstood me, you corrected them, and I'm glad you did. That you see the familiarity. It's one of the things that one of Nissim said about India, but Tavish Kher said about parts of India. Tavish Kher, in his poetic collection Our World, says about traveling by train around the country, how he felt at home, even in Tamil Nadu. And he's thinking of the state which is the most different in his head, right? In terms of language, can't understand a word what people are speaking. They pretend or they genuinely don't understand him, and he's thinking of those times, and he said he still felt at home, right? So he saw the familiar, even in the most unfamiliar, right? So translation does that anyway, right? And wonderfully, and I think that's part of what we're doing. When we come together as India, we will come together because we also see the familiar. We cannot just come together if we cannot come together if we don't see the familiar. But I want us to come together seeing the familiar, but celebrating the unfamiliar, not marginalizing it, not judging it, right? But accommodating, including it. That's one. The other thing about translating, I mean, this almost all of us translators would have come across at some point or other when translating from any language, but definitely from Indian languages. That our languages incorporate, as I said, so much from other languages. Our writers are all, most of them, so. I would not even say bilingual, at least unless it's a very linguistic term, which means multilingual, right? So there are many languages that inform our writing and our being, how we are, right? So that goes into what we write, and sometimes unconsciously, you may have got something from somewhere else and not even be aware it's coming from somewhere else because it's so much part of you, right? As a translator, you are teased by this all the time when you're reading. You hear echoes from a different language. You don't know whether it is a genuinely done translation or whether it's a translation done by a person who is not able to understand the language. Right? So, translation does that. It incorporates, as I said, so much from other languages. Our writers are all, most of them, so. I would not even say bilingual, at least
It's true. There's a of sound.
The video seems to be frozen.
She's writing for a Tamil audience. So it needs to be clearly translated into Tamil for them to understand. She may hint clearly. She may, of course, say this is from this from the Hindi movie or Hindi song. She may have said. She may say, or he sang in Hindi. She may say, but the whole thing will be in Tamil. Right? The whole thing will be Tamil. So she has to translate. For me, I have the advantage of going back to the text that she's translating from and having therefore two versions, her Tamil version and the other version. And therefore, when I'm translating into English, I can actually, as all translators, if you already have a text that's been translated into a different language, it's an advantage because you have two texts to translate from, to compare, to choose your words from, right? And to sometimes disagree with, which also helps you to translate. Saying, no. I would not have done that in Tamil like this. I will definitely not do it in English like this, right? So there are things that help you out. Of course, it changes because I have an audience in English which may know the original text too. She didn't have it when she was writing in Tamil. I have it and I'm writing in English. Part of my audience may understand all this, right? Which makes it more difficult for me because they have to accept my translation. I can't get away with saying I'm translating Ambai's Tamil. As far as they're concerned, I'm translating the Hindi or the Marathi or whatever it is. So I need to get as close to that as possible, right? So because that audience will be reading. And there may be errors. It's not like all of us are born perfect translators and nobody is. And there may be things that people disagree with, right? But, Professor Rizvi, this is something that all of us translators have to take the risk with and have to do.
Absolutely. One interesting incident comes to mind. You mentioned Shama Fateh Ali and how there was this incident between, entirely in English between the protagonist and the coolie. And, I recall in my childhood when the Sabzi Wali would come, she would speak only Marathi. And our neighbors from Salem would speak only English. And the conversation happened in Marathi from one side and in English from the other, and they perfectly understood each other. There was no way they would not understand. There was no way they would not understand each other. It just happened perfectly. So
this is something that happens beautifully, right? In neighbors. I know my grandmother would speak in Telugu to her Telugu neighbor, in Tamil to a Telugu neighbor, and the Telugu neighbor replied in Telugu. So one didn't know Telugu at all, the other didn't know Tamil at all, and they talked to each other.
Yeah, and they understood each other.
Because context was very clear, right?
Yeah.
What were you talking about? You're talking about prices of vegetables having going up, or the sabzi wala cheating, etc. The maid not coming, the maid coming. Their contexts were very clear.
Yeah.
So they would always understand each other.
Yeah, that's the best thing.
But a Tamil speaker trying to speak Hindi in Delhi bargaining in those days, they would get that date and die wrong all the time. All the time. So they'd end up bargaining for more. No, I won't give 1.5. I'll give you 2.5.
Okay. That's a funny thing. May I ask you one more question, Professor Prasad? This poetry that you have in it. I was just wondering, when you translate poetry, do you look at the conveying the meaning, or do you look also at conveying the meter and the rhyme and the rhythm? I mean, I think it's very, very difficult to do that.
It's very tough. Translating poetry is the toughest thing.
Yeah.
And when I teach translation courses, the one thing I make them all do all the time is to translate poetry.
Oh.
Because once they start feeling comfortable translating poetry, they crack translation. Right? They're not going to be they're not going to find translating prose very difficult because they're doing the most difficult thing, which is to translate poetry. Right?
Yeah.
And translating poetry is very, very difficult for very many reasons. But you said the most important reasons you said immediately, right? Which is that poems are something which actually convey with both in terms, convey with indirection, with brevity, and with form, right? A poem and its form are inseparable. How do you translate that into a different language which may not have such a form in the first place, right? The rhythm, some very often we tell people when we meet poets and they're reading the poetry in translation, we tell them, please, can you read it in the original as well? Then we'll listen because we can't understand it, but we'd like to know how you sound in your language. When they do that, immediately the translation falls flat because the rhythm, the way they read out that in that language, the way they're written the poem, it sounds so different and so good, so unique. It seems that the poet's voice gets a life of its own, and you generally say, "Oh my God, she sounds so good in that language," right? But when they start reading the English translation or Hindi translation or Tamil translation, whatever, it won't sound the same. It'll never sound the same because each language has its own sense of rhythm, it has its own meter that works, it has resonances. Certain meters have resonances for you which take you to other kinds of poems. And so it just may not work for the kind of poem that's being read out. So, it's a huge problem. What do you do? What do you do when you translate poetry? What are you translating it for? And what do you do with imagery? What do you do with some kind of metaphor which doesn't work in the other language? What do you do with all this? All right. So most one of the things that I teach my students is that when they are translating poetry, work hard at it, and then abandon it at some point of time because you can't go beyond that. Right? This is the best effort that you can make at this point of time. Maybe you come back to it later, 5 years later, and maybe do a different job. Right? But get it in your head very clearly that there may be certain poems that work simply for message. They're all right. You can do them. But poems which work what is poetry except language being played with? And if you can reproduce the play, you're almost there. You're almost there. Even if people say, no, the poem does more, theek hai, you have actually performed something similar. You perform something similar, right? So what is being performed in Hindi, you manage to perform in English. Wow. Most people can't, right? But as I said, this is something that even in translating prose you realize, because every short story is also a performance in language. And if I can perform it similarly in English, I'm halfway there. I'm even 3/4 way there. Right. And if you can't do that, I've lost the energy of the writer. If I've lost the energy, the pace of the story, then my translation is something else altogether. It's not doing any kind of justice to the writer's story in the original language. So I think, yes, Fatima ji, talking about translating poetry, you hit the nail on the head, but I think it's great training to understand how to perform in language and how to re-perform. See a performance and see if you can do the same.
True, Professor Prasad. Thank you. That's very well elucidated.
Professor Prasad, there is Dr. R.B. Sharma, who's in our midst. Dr. Sharma, would you like to make some observations?
Thank you, sir, very much for. We are really privileged to have you amongst us, and it was really a treat for us. My submission is with regard to the translation of ancient texts. There was an effort to translate Ala, which is a Bundelkhandi, very popular folk tale. What happens when you translate a decontextualized text? Because that context is completely lost. Even if you recreate in the same language, there's much lost because of the times that have lapsed. So when you translate that in a foreign language like English, or say it's second language like English, so how to handle this kind of problem? Can you advise the translators of ancient texts? Some advice, some experience, sharing some experience.
I'm no one to give advice, but I can share the concern. And I'm saying it's not a concern just with English or French or German or whatever, right? You translate that into Tamil, you'll have a problem. Translate that to Marathi, you'll have a problem, right? Why? Because it gets decontextualized anyway in translation, because it needs to be contextualized completely. So any translation that does not attempt to recontextualize will fail. If I just treat it as a folk tale, right, and just like folk tales that work across any language and all that, then it may not do justice at all to its place in where it is, to its location. So what I would suggest, therefore, a strategy is something that publishers will never ever like, unless it is something that they think they can actually sell in a particular way, because publishers won't publish things they cannot sell. What I would advise for that, what I would try, is a very academic translation, with a very long introduction or a clear introduction, which places it with notes, with with critical comments. Otherwise, the translation, it just, what does it hope to accomplish? Right. So there are many such texts that we have where we need to have a critical apparatus around the translation, and it is us as translators who can give it, or people that are put together the same volume, because nobody is going to look at the critical apparatus outside the text, right? So unless it's an academic text, nobody ever does. So to be able to do this, therefore, you need to be a proper critic come translator, to be able to completely give the work around the text, give all the outer work if you want, right? Do it. If you can't, then I would just not even try, right? Because publishers, you have to convince a publisher to publish it fully, right? With a critical introduction, with notes. There's no other way it will work, right? And I'm saying it's whether I'm doing it in forget English. I said forget any language, though I think English is more and more an Indian language, but let's forget that, right? Let's forget English. To any language you think of as Indian, it's not going to work. It's not going to work without that critical outwork. And if you do that, yes, it'll work. Yes, it'll work. Other than that, I cannot. I can only share your concerns. There is no advice. This is what you have thought of yourself. So I'm not saying anything that you have not thought of. I'm just saying you must just hold firm. If that is why I like university presses, which we don't have in this country, right? If there was funding available, so we could actually do some academic publishing of this kind. Part of it, maybe I was hoping that something the National Translation Mission would do stuff of this kind.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Here's a question from one of our students, Faiza Mumtaz, and she wants to know, if you could describe India in 3 words, what language would you choose to interpret it in, and why?
Whichever language I'm speaking at that moment. Right. This is a question that we asked differently in different times. I know when you were a student and I was a part of Center of Linguistics in English, a number of people were trying to convince me to become a linguist and things of that kind, and also to give up my claim that English was my first language. And I remember a very famous linguist asking me, what language do you curse in? I said, forget me, my father curses in English. So he said, what language do you count in? So I said, I count in the language that I'm speaking at that point of time. If I'm speaking in Hindi to somebody, I'll count in Hindi. If I'm speaking Tamil, I count in Tamil. If I speak in English, I count in English. And he thought I was lying. He said, that's not true. And I said, that's absolutely true. Right? So it's just that. So if you ask me to talk about India, and I'm speaking to you in Hindi, sure. I may say Hindustan instead of saying Bharat, but that's a different matter altogether. Right? But I will speak in Hindi. If I'm speaking in Hindi, I'll speak in English. I'll talk about 3 words about India. I'll say it in 2 words, my country. Right?
That's true. There's a question from Rajkumar, but I think you've already answered part of it. What are the things we need to keep in mind while translating folk tales? And he also wants,
He also wants?
he also wants to know if translating a text from a different culture by someone who isn't from that culture makes translation doubly difficult. And do you feel that when we are not acquainted with a different culture, it sometimes destroys both the cultures? The translation makes the text mixture of two cultures.
There is two things that I must say here. One, I'll say what Sujit Mukherjee once said. Sujit Mukherjee said that he doesn't mind a bad English translation by an Indian who belonging to a language that's being translated into English. He said that I don't mind the bad English translation because the English can be improved. At least he's got or she's got the culture right. Right? So I don't have to worry about errors in that. I just need to worry about the English. Right? And he said, if it's done by someone who does not know that first language so well but knows English very well, that's a problem. Right? Now, this is where I think I differ from Sujit in sense of, I mean, I'm not saying differ from him, but what I'm really saying is that I don't think you should attempt.
I think there's a audio problem. Is there a problem at that end?
I think Professor Prasad has a problem.
Professor Prasad, we can't hear you.
That it's being written. If I don't know it, if you don't make the effort, I should not translate.
Sir, we missed you because there was a interruption.
Oh, I think maybe my internet has started behaving. It normally does in the evening.
There was another question, I think you have already answered it. Shivani Sharma, our MA English student, has a question. How is it different? Translating a prose different from translating a poem? We've discussed this aspect. Yeah.
There's one. May I ask one question?
Yes, please, Dr.
Professor
Rizvi.
Prasad.
Yes, please. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm just going on flooding you with questions. But this whole idea that Amba is a woman and she's a feminist writer. Did you have any problem translating, language, or did you find any difference in the language that she would use or the way you would use it? Would you like to comment on that?
Yes. I was asked this once by a student in an interview. And I was praised for this by a reviewer. And both let me slightly diffuse because, first of all, let me clear the air out Ambe because she'll get upset if I don't. Ambe is a feminist in terms of research orientation, in terms of reading, in terms of the way she approaches the world. Her archive, Sparrow, is a feminist archive that she's the director of, and she's done historical work. She's done a book of criticism in Tamil, which is again a feminist reading. But she, Mahashweta Devi, and I'm trying to remember the third writer, they were part of a colloquium in the 1990s, and a young academic castigated someone, one of the writers, the third writer, for not being a feminist enough, for not writing about certain issues. Mahashweta Devi and Ambai both jumped into it, and both of them said that they were not feminist writers, that they were not women writers, that they were writers. Right? She said, I remember very clearly Ambai saying that Prasad is here, he's chairing the meet. Would you call him, if you call him throughout, you call him male critic, male writer, and ask him to write in a masculinist way, then you can talk to me and call me a woman writer and say feminist way. Right? Otherwise, let's just shut up. Let's not talk in these terms. I'm a writer. I will write what I want to write. Right? Number one. Number two, I kind of look at it differently again, not from Ambai, but extending it ethically. There is sometimes people think it's an ethical issue, right? They think that you're appropriating the voice of somebody else when you're translating, right? So if you don't belong to the gender, community, caste, right, color, race, that you may, in translating that particular writer, you're appropriating all over again, you're appropriating that voice, right? So two things. One, the writer should not appropriate. Two, the translator should not appropriate. Now, as a writer, Ambai will say, it is a duty as a writer She thinks a thing as a writer is to be able to imagine everybody in every situation. Right? She keeps saying she doesn't write only women, she writes men. Right? She writes everybody. She writes, so she keeps saying, men love too in my stories. Men are disappointed too in my stories. Men are complicated too in my stories. Right? So that on her part. And then the next bit, which therefore she would completely deny, which is that a male translator cannot translate her stories. Right? She would say anybody. It's a question of translating well or translating badly. Full stop. Now, and what I told this young man is that I may not even understand his concept of life because it's generational at times. What did my parents mean when they talked about it? They talked about love. What did they mean when they thought of love? What my generation thought of as love, right? It may differ even in my generation from different sections of society, gender, everywhere, right? But it can be generational, it can be community based, it can be caste based because you're in different time zones. You can be, I'm not talking progressive. I'm just talking about how you can be in different locations, right? And therefore, but does it mean that I will not have empathy for? I mean, you may be using the word love differently. Your idea of expectation of love may be different. But once I read you and I talk to you, can I not understand or empathy for it? Even though I use the word love differently, I would, right? Writers would, and translators should, right? So that's, I'm glad you asked the question because sometimes I've been the woman writer's voice. I was saying, I've got the writer's voice. She's a woman, but it's not like a woman writer's voice.
That reminds me, Prasad,
True.
of what
Thank you,
Anita
Professor
Desai once
Prasad.
said
Yeah.
to me when I asked her a similar question about men and their anxieties. She said that why do we have to think that men have no anxieties? They have their own constraints, their own fears. And as a writer, when you write, you really try to transgress those boundaries and you try to eliminate those boundaries and you look at something which lies beyond. That's a very relevant issue that you have raised, Prasad. And here there is a very long question, although I think we've spent more than an hour and you must be tired. But here, can I read this question for you? It's a longish question.
Sure.
When it comes to translating works coming from indigenous communities, creating in native languages, the question of ethics often come to the fore. Who benefits economically, etc. We do get to know people and become inclusive, but at the same time, the translator perhaps also indulges in appropriation of some sort. And what are your thoughts on this? If we translate such works, what is the most ethical way to go about it? Here's a question from Vedamini Vikram Singh, one of our research scholars.
See, it is, as I said, unless you do it as, it's the same answer for translating folk, right? Because you need the critical outwork, you need the self-reflexivity, you need to critically look at your own intention and to explain it, right? Your own position, and be aware throughout of how it can be received and how you can subvert that reception, right? If you don't do this fully clearly, then you may think you're doing out of the best intentions, but you can be misunderstood and you can be misperceived, right? Because if you don't do outer work, it doesn't mean that you are doing it appropriate, you're doing it for unethical purposes. That doesn't mean that at all. But it means it can be read unethical, received as unethical, received as, doing exactly what you don't want to be seen as doing. Then it is behoves you do the critical outwork, you situate your work clearly and your position. You're always aware of your position as translated, what it means. You accept your privileged position, you critique your own privileged position, but because you are in a privileged position, it doesn't mean that you should be you should be frozen in inaction and cannot do something which can actually play a good positive role, right? And that, so it should not be that that I'm privileged, I can do anything. It should not be that I'm privileged, therefore I should not do anything. Because everything that I do is privileged and wrong. Yes, accept your privilege. Understand where your privilege comes from. Right? Critique your own positions. See where, so that you become, as I said, non-judgmental in terms of your privilege. Do the critical outward. Give it in those terms to people completely. Right? And after that, if it doesn't work still, then it's a pity. But you made every effort.
That's true. A note from Dr. Meenakshi Pava. She's thanking you for illuminating our minds on translation, and she says that your insights are invaluable to some of us who are fledgling translators. There's another question, one last question. We will not be taking any more questions, but here there's one question from Yusuf Ayaz. Who do you think would do a better job in translating a work from language A to language B? The native speaker of language A who knows language B, or the translator whose native language is B who knows language A? While the former understands the dynamics of the original language better, the latter was born in the target language.
I think I answered this actually already. But having said that, I don't understand native language and all that, right? Which I tell people English is my first language. Of course, you would laugh because how much I laughed when I went to England in 1982 for a language teaching workshop, and I could call them natives because they said they're native speakers of English. I said, "Wow, wonderful, you natives! I need to teach you guys, right? I need to civilize the natives." But having said that, native speaker. Am I a native speaker of Tamil? I don't think so. I know Tamil, but am I a native speaker? I'm not sure I would put it that way, right? Am I a native speaker of English? Nobody will accept that position, right? But do I know English well? I hope so. I think so. Do I know Tamil well enough to translate from Tamil, not into Tamil, but from Tamil? Yes, I hope so. I think so, right? And so this is how it works, right? That's how it works. As I said, which language are you most comfortable in? If you are creatively comfortable in both languages, you're a fantastic option for a translator. But if you're critically comfortable in one language and creatively comfortable in the other language, which includes critical, right, which is a higher level of comfort, then I think from the critical to the creative comfort of the language will work very, very well. Right? The other way around may not. Will not, I would think, but let's say may not.
It's almost an hour and a half, Professor Prasad, and I'm indeed very, very grateful to you for having spared your time and your valuable insights. I'm sure are going to help the students and the teachers as well who are involved in teaching and doing translation. I would now like to invite Dr. Rajesh Sharma for a formal vote of thanks. Dr. Rajesh Sharma.
Thank you, madam. Good evening, one and all. Professor Prasad, you really made this evening memorable. This was an intellectual treat, and the extended time that you have spared for us, I think we never thought that it will continue to this extent. And I think the question hour session was much more than the original talk. This extended to this extent that all kinds of questions were taken by you, translation and gender issues, translation and the temporality, translation and the poetry, fiction, I think disability, all kinds of topics were touched. It was most comprehensive talk that we could have thought of. And I think every one of us stands benefited by this. We would have loved you, sir, if you were physically present in our department. This digital presence actually, falls short of the kind of the interaction, the kind of the vibration that we get when we are physically present. But thank you, sir, so much for being with us. And we request you to be to honor us again whenever our head of the department, considers this our request, we would be requesting her again to do it. This regional literature has its own character. And I was reading poetry by Dr. Unyal, and the last lines of that, 3 lines of that poetry I would like to recite, because that explains, that describes the character, because poetry is such which can be used to explain all aspects of life. And these lines explain, they describe the character of the regional literature. I'm, transpolating that from that life to regional literature. These are her lines. मत पूछ, मेरी हिंदी उतनी अच्छी नहीं है, please forgive me for that. मत पूछ मुझसे मेरे चेहरे का राज, the texture of the regional literature. मत पूछ मुझसे मेरे चेहरे का राज, गुमशुदा होकर दिया मैंने जिंदगी का हिसाब. This is what the literature, regional literature does. It narrates the life, but it remains unknown. And I think the translation will do a lot to bring this forth. And the future of English studies in India probably lies with the translation studies. That we as a department are changing. We have many papers. I think in honors also we have one paper, Indian Literature and Translation. In PG also we have this paper, Indian Literature and Translation. We are doing whatever as a department we are supposed to do to make this vibrant and as a study subject. I take this opportunity to thank our head of the department for making this possible. Thank you, Ranu Madam, for taking all the troubles and organizing these events again and again, making us part of that intellectual environment that as a department we are keeping up even in these pandemic times. I thank all my colleagues who have been part of this program, and researcher scholars, students, everyone who made this possible. Thank you all very much. And thank you, sir, once again for taking out your time and making this possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. And thank you, Professor Prasad. He's one of us. So it's always like he's a part of the family. And we have that sense of bonding with him. And Prasad being my teacher and my friend and guide in so many ways has been a fantastic, friend over these years. And I'm indeed very, very touched, Professor Prasad, that you came today. You joined us in this session today and you enlightened us with your views on translation. You introduced us to a writer called Ambai. And we hope to see you soon next year. Maybe once the pandemic is over, you will be in our midst. It would be a pleasure to host you.
Look forward to that.
Yeah. Thank you. Can we all switch on our videos for a group photograph?
I enjoyed myself. I hope you did.
Oh, we did.
Yes,
Most
we
certainly.
Yes.
Most certainly.
Yeah. Can we have a quick picture, please? All of you switch on your videos.